Okay, you've made it. This is lecture 13.1. This is the last week of class. So what now? Um, this course is designed to provide you with the tools that you need, the understandings that you need to understand a lot of the social problems in our society. And where we often drop the ball as sociologists is giving you a whole bunch of information and saying, okay, there you go, and not showing you solutions to those problems, right? Well, um, if that happens, you tend to get depressed, or you tend to get paranoid, or you tend to think the world's falling apart. And one of my goals is to give you some tools that you need that if you want to change the world, go ahead and do it. I really don't honestly care about your political vision. I don't care about how you see the world. But I do care that you are civically engaged. And I'm always proud when I see my students are like that. So this last chapter is, this last section, this last week, is intended to show you what you could do. So I provided for you, either through the bookstore or I have it electronically, a version of Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals. So I want to tell you why this book, why Alinsky. I will give you a brief overview of chapters 1 through 8. The only chapter I expect you to read for this week is chapter 9. And it's relatively easy reading. Alinsky at least is an interesting fellow. So why this book? I was a union organizer for 3 years. And as a union organizer, we had a mantra: educate, agitate, organize, right? So first, in that line of work, you teach people what they need to know. You teach them the facts of the situation. Then you get them really angry about it, right? And you get them really ready to go do something with that righteous anger. And then you use that energy from agitate to go out and organize and change the world and form new stuff. And that's where you get the so what moment, right? Rules for Radicals has been used as a handbook for many social movement organizers. So it is not only a handbook on how to be an organizer and an activist, but it's also a handbook on how to understand those people. So it's both a practical tool if you want to do that stuff, and it's a good way to get into the head of an organizer, to understand those types of people. And again, yeah, you can also use it if you do want to try to change something. One note on the text, there is some profanity in the text. It is mostly in the form of examples and discussions or rhetorical slogans. There's a few curse words in there, but it's largely there to make examples of real words examples. It's not like a filthy book or anything. It's just a very solidly real book. But we have to talk about Alinsky himself, because he was kind of a character. Alinsky was a man from New York City. He lived from 1909 to 1972. He established what we now know as community organizing as a profession and as an activity. And his community organizing focused on improving the lives and conditions of African Americans living in urban ghettos in the mid-20th century. His ideas inspired much of the political organizing of the late 1960s, so a lot of that era. And another thing, you should always know who your author is. Alinsky was ethnically Jewish, and he was ethnically Jewish living during the time of World War II, right? So he saw his people being under attack, right? But he was also staunchly anti-religious. So he makes a few snide comments in the book that are kind of anti-religious. Some of his comments are pretty inappropriate as far as I'm concerned. I'm not a real orthodox person, but I think some of the things he says are just kind of rude. But with that said, he was a genius of what he did. While he was a leftist, he would fall into the Democratic camp or farther left than Democratic. He rejected party politics. So he would not listen to what Democrats said just because they were Democrats, right? He would do what he thought was right. And that's important to keep in mind. Also, historically, it's important to note that in 2008, Alinsky's works were revitalized because a lot of the tactics that he used in community organizing were directly applied to the 2008 Obama campaign. That's another way in which Barack Obama's campaign and presidency was very different, because he was using political organizing. He was using community organizing tactics in political organizing, which was very successful for President Obama. And also, in her early career, Hillary Clinton was also said to have been an advocate of Alinsky's ideas. But as she became more of a hardline politician and more of a moderate politician, she rejected a lot of the political positions and strategies of Alinsky and took on different, more traditional political strategies. So I'm going to give you a real quick overview of Rules for Radicals. So I'm going to cover these first 8 chapters pretty quickly. And yeah, I'm skimming over a lot of stuff. The first chapter, called The Purpose, this was a general call to arms. It clearly stated that the strategy is not ideological, and dogma should be rejected. What does that mean? Well, you don't need to do a strategy in organizing just because you've always done it, and every situation is different. He also stated that the powerful in society punish those who challenge authority. And so, of course, the powerful, of course, authority figures will dislike activists. He broke society into haves, have-nots, and little mores, which is interesting. Often we talk about social struggle in terms of haves and have-nots, oppressor and oppressed. What Alinsky said is, yeah, we have oppressors, we have oppressed, but we also have this middle class of people that want a little bit more, right? And the fact that they want a little bit more puts the middle class in a position in which they can go either way. They could side with the powerful, they could side with the powerless. And what the organizer needs to do is try to convince the want a little mores, convince the middle class to come help the downtrodden. Chapter 2 was called Of Means and Ends. The chapter was not called Do the ends justify the means, but do these ends justify these means? And this was one of Alinsky's major contributions to organizing. His major stance was that every situation is not the same. Each situation needs to be judged on its own merits, and sometimes extreme measures are called for, but other times they are not, right? It depends on the situation you're in. Using the same tactic will not work every time. Protests don't work every single time. Sometimes protests are great, sometimes they're not. Movements require clarity of vision and action. So to put this in modern terms, sometimes you punch a Nazi. You don't always punch the Nazi, right? But sometimes, according to Alinsky, it is appropriate to use violence if necessary. In our democracy, usually you do not want to use violence. But Alinsky would also say that sometimes it might be okay. And this chapter lays out the basis for ethical decision making in social movements, right? It's not an all or nothing black and white thing. Sometimes there is a need for extreme tactics, is what Alinsky would say. Chapter 3 is a chapter about communication. It's called A Word About Words. The words that you use are important, and your word choice must be powerful as someone conveying information. And that's most of what an organizer does, is communicate information. Your words must speak to your audience's self-interest. So you have to be talking not about the thing you're interested in as an organizer, but you need to be talking about the things that the people that you're organizing are interested in. He also says to start off big with your demands and then back down as needed. So he's talking about how to take a strong opening stance and then be able to compromise from there, right? If you just ask for a little bit and then someone says no, there's no room to ask for a little bit less than that to allow for compromise, right? And that's kind of a basic for any kind of negotiation. You talk to a lawyer, they'll tell you the same thing. Alinsky says not to let your ego get in the way, that it might be strategically necessary for you to be made to look like an idiot, but to help the greater cause, you might have to bite the bullet. And he also says that we need to embrace conflict as it suits us. So if there is a conflict, not necessarily a fight, but a verbal conflict or whatever, and you take advantage of that situation as an organizer, that could suit you. Chapter 4 is about the education of an organizer. So this is talking about what it takes to make new organizers. Organizers come from a variety of backgrounds, and you need to embrace that as someone that may be starting a movement. Those who train organizers need to use the personal experience of those organizers, right? You need to take advantage of this person who is, take advantage of someone's ethnicity. Take advantage of someone's race. Take advantage of someone's lived experiences. And use that stuff that they can talk about that you might not be able to talk about. For example, here in Columbus, we have a lot of workers who speak Somali, the Somali language. And if you have an organizer who speaks Somali and who can relate to Somali people, that's incredibly useful. Anyway, domestic life will suffer for organizers. Organizers do not have tranquil 9-to-5 jobs. Organizers sometimes have tumultuous romantic relationships because the organizer life is not tranquil. You work 60, 80 hours a week. It's tough. Different organizers are effective in different situations. That kind of comes up with a thing we just talked about. An organizer must be curious and imaginative. So an organizer must have a drive to be an organizer. An organizer must want to poke around things, want to be a little bit of a troublemaker. And organizers must be irreverent. So organizers must be willing to poke fun at authority. Organizers must be not afraid of authority. He might say that organizers must detest authority and want to challenge authority. Those are good qualities in an organizer. Chapter 5 is another chapter on communication. This is more about communicating big concepts and the ability to touch base with people. This is the ability to communicate effectively is the most importantly quality of an organizer. I'd absolutely agree with that. And you must communicate with people in their own words. So if you're talking to someone who swears a lot, you should swear in kind, right? You should speak the language of the person. If you're going to be organizing a bunch of church people, you need to knock off the swearing and talk about the Bible, right? If you don't know anything about the Bible and you're organizing church people, you need to brush up a little bit on the Bible. You need to talk to people in the words that they use. And another reiteration, you need to talk about people's lived experiences. You need to talk about where people are on the ground, as it were. You need to talk about that stuff. Chapter 6 lays out what new organizers need to do. So after you've trained your organizer, after you've taught your organizer how to communicate, then what about those first couple days and weeks of being an organizer? A new organizer needs to gain the trust of leaders in a community. The organizer must be the champion of the people and an enemy of the establishment, right? So the organizer needs to find those leaders in the community and show them that you really get them and that you can't stand the opponent that they're trying to rise up against. An organizer's first job is to build power for the organization, right? And a powerful organization is an organization that can help people. So the organizer is not about personal glory. The organizer is about helping the organization and the people that the organization is trying to help. It's about trying to make their lives better. Now, finally, we have a chapter on tactics. And Alinsky would say that tactics are doing what you can with what you have. So if your group is powerful, you need to show that power and demonstrate that power in the ways that you have power. If your group is weak, you need to hide that weakness. And this, I can't really lay out the entire chapter because it's a very detailed chapter, but chapter 7 lays out many rules for determining tactics and strategic thinking making in community organizing. Chapter 8 goes on to a little bit more technical of tactics. He calls this the genesis of tactic proxy. What he means here is once you have your tactics, once you have your plan, and it's great to have plans, but and I can tell you this from personal experience, in an organizing campaign, plans always fall apart. They always do, but that doesn't mean you don't need plans, because you need the plan as a starting point. And then after the plan falls apart, you take a breather, and then you reconfigure a new plan. He states that you never become wedded to your plan, but you do need a plan, right? And then once you get the materials in front of you that you have to reconfigure that plan and to adapt those tactics, you do those to match the situation. So what is he saying? He's saying if you're in a tough situation, something doesn't quite work right, you evolve. You don't give up, you change, you modify, you do what you need to do to win. And now finally, Chapter 9, The Way Ahead. This is what we're going to be really delving into this week. And just a re-emphasis, this is the only chapter I expect you to read this week. The thesis statement of this chapter, and this is confusing. What exactly does he mean by this? Is that organizing will now and for the foreseeable future center upon the white middle class. What the hell does that mean? What do you mean we need to focus on white people? What do you mean that white people are the way forward? That sounds really jarring to the modern ear. But he really does have a point. He's not being racist. He's not being classist. He has a point. And we'll delve into this a little bit. So here's Alinsky's justification. Keep in mind that the United States was far more white in Alinsky's era than it is today, right? Really what he's talking about is the middle classes. He's not as much talking about white people, but he is to a degree, and I'll talk about race in a moment. So Alinsky says that 75% of the population identifies as middle class, and that is true. A lot of us identify as middle class, but there are different grades of middle class. And included in the upper middle class are doctors, lawyers, and managers. Middle class are office workers, and lower middle class are our factory workers, and these people called the working class, right? And these portions of the middle class actually behave in slightly different ways. Alinsky argues that to be successful, you need to be able to harness this middle class because they're the most people, and they're those want a little more, as he talked about, right? If you want your movement to be successful, you need to get this biggest chunk in America to come along with you. With that said, there are a couple notes on this. In this chapter, Alinsky's talking about middle class income and income distributions. Keep in mind, he was writing this in the 70s, so his numbers on that regard are entirely off. Don't even look at those numbers. But his breakdown of the three portions of the middle class do roughly match those with generally accepted sociological theory. So he's talking about the same types of people that are present in society, but he doesn't really have, things have changed a little bit since the 60s, is what I'm basically getting at. Now, another major point he makes is, gotta go back a slide for a second. You see this upper middle class and middle class? Those are two groups of people, but the lower middle class, that working class, those are the people that need to be taken into consideration when organizing, because a lot of organizers, they come from the middle or upper middle class, right? And a lot of organizers have trouble communicating with the lower middle class. And when organizing campaigns fail, it's often because, and when political campaigns fail, it's because they failed to communicate to the lower middle class properly. And there are a couple things to keep in mind when communicating with the lower middle class. First of all, they have not had the privilege of a college education, and they may see college students as being spoiled and as being lazy, right? And as a college student, or as someone with a college education, there is a tendency to apply what you have learned about social justice, about oppression, about all of these things. And when you're talking to your grandpa or you're talking to your uncle and talking to them about oppression, right? You might come off as being a snobby, spoiled brat, right? Because look at you. You've lived a pretty comfortable life. Who are you to talk about this shit, right? Which is what grandpa might be thinking, right? And it's really easy, unless you use the language of the lower middle class, unless you communicate to the person properly, it's really easy to lose working class people. Because working class people have struggled most of their lives for everything that they've had, right? And if you don't recognize that, if you don't recognize some of the privileges maybe that you've had that they haven't had, and if you don't understand their world, then you will lose them, is what Alinsky's saying. And here are some more differences with the working class and other parts of the middle class. Working class people have struggled the most for what they've had, right? Other parts of the middle class may not understand that struggle. Members of the working class are members of community organizations such as churches, unions, fraternal organizations, bowling leagues. And if you want to win these people, you have to win those groups. This has changed a little bit since the 1960s, and it is still largely true. Working class people do tend to be part of these groups. Things like bowling leagues have kind of gone away, but there are other groups as well. Working class people may see upper middle class and middle class people as snobby, and liberals as being snobby, and think that they're being holier than thou, right? And if they come off as this way, they won't be effective. So I have a story that really touches in on that. When I was a union organizer, we were having a dinner, and there were these, I was a couple years out of college, and there were these girls that were in college at the moment, and it was me, these two young women, and this working class guy that was a member of the union. And I was a vegetarian at the time. I'm not anymore. And these two girls were vegetarians. And they were talking about like the virtues of vegetarianism, right? And how, how great it made them feel and how terrible it was to eat animals and all that. Well, this alienated that other guy, right? I wasn't taking part of the conversation. I was just observing, right? But they were really emphasizing the virtues of vegetarianism and how good and ethical and great it was. And there's a certain thing to that. But I could tell it was making this other guy feel like he felt, they weren't trying to convey this message, those young women, but he felt that they thought that they were better than him because they were vegetarians and he wasn't, right? And it's not that they were trying to convey that. They were just talking about something they were passionate about. But there was a moment where the relationship was damaged because those young organizers were trying to convey something and they weren't communicating effectively. And we need to be aware of these things if we want to help people in society. Now on race. Alinsky makes some assumptions. Alinsky does get some credit because he is a white man in the 1950s who was trying to help black people. So he does get some points there. But he assumes that if you have been the victim of racial oppression, you will be more likely to, quote, get it. right? So if you have been oppressed, you might be more willing to help with his kind of political organizing. And there is a certain element of truth to that, but there is also a certain element of assumption there that is somewhat problematic. With that said, he's not saying that whites are smarter or superior to non-whites in any way. What he's saying is that we need to be able to communicate with whites because they are the ones with power. They are the ones with majority in society. And whites are less the majority than what they used to be. But there are a lot of white people in our country, effectively. On both class and race, remember, Alinsky is making a numbers argument. And today, white people are still the numeric majority in the United States. It's about 61%. It's a lot less than what it was in Alinsky's time. And Alinsky makes the argument, if you only organize minority groups, then you will have to coalition build. And coalition building is good, but it's better to not have to coalition build, right? Because if you coalition build, if you have to work with other organizations, you have to make concessions with those organizations. So you don't want to be making concessions with your friends. You want to be making concessions to your enemies, right? And if you make concessions, your impact won't be as powerful. So you want your vision to be as pure as possible going into what would effectively be the final conflict or whatever. So that's the question, isn't it? With this whole course, what do you think, right? How are you going to use this? We will talk about the applicability of Alinsky's ideas in the modern world. And did he have a point? Was he wrong? Was he way off? Was he being kind of racist? Interesting stuff. So I will talk to you in the discussion boards.